On January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo, was murdered by a firing squad.
The fate of Patrice Lumumba is known at last. He is dead.
In the 1960s, independence movements worldwide were gaining steam. So much so that the year of 1960 was dubbed the Year of Africa. People were rising up and throwing off the shackles of colonialism. Colonized subjects of the world, unite. All you have to lose are your chains. Against the backdrop of World War II, the colonial empires were having trouble keeping their colonized subjects under their thumb. The war had demonstrated in painful detail the contradiction between soldiers fighting fascism abroad whilst experiencing it at home. The Algerian War of Independence against France. Charles de Gaulle telling the colonies, "Je vous ai compris."
Je vous ai compris.
Personne n'a compris ce que de Gaulle a compris. L'ambiguïté lui sert de stratégie.
Francophone African countries having a referendum on their own freedom. All across Africa, liberation movements were gaining power. The idea of Pan-Africanism, of the unity of the African people brought together by their mutual struggle against colonialism, began to flourish. And it was against this backdrop that the 34-year-old Patrice Lumumba would found the mnc-l Congolese, or MNC, in 1958. At the time, the Congo was still a Belgian colony. A brief history of the Congo. The history of the Congo prior to independence is one characterized by ruthless bloodshed, horror, and genocide. King Leopold II, otherwise known as the most despicable leech to ever live, took over the territory in the late 1800s. He was interested in the territory due to its natural resources, including rubber, ivory, and other minerals. Through forced labor, systematic human rights abuses, including cutting off the hands of those who did not meet the rubber quotas, and mass death, King Leopold was able to siphon an amount that today would be equal to $1 billion from the Congo. In exchange for such riches, millions of Congolese were killed through famine, disease, and execution. Historians dispute the total amount of people killed by the Belgian occupation, but Susan Williams, the author of White Malice, the CIA, and the Covert Recolonization of Africa, estimates that 10 million people were killed, which amounts to about 50% of the population at the time. King Leopold II paved the way for the aptly named Berlin Conference, which was organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck at Leopold's request. At the Berlin Conference, European powers came together to carve up the territories of Africa. The United States was also in attendance at the Berlin Conference, which is often forgotten, I think, because the United States technically did not have any colonies in Africa. That technicality can be expounded upon another time. One by one, the European powers carved the continent of Africa up in what is now known as the Scramble for Africa. This is the context in which Patrice Lumumba created the mnc-l Congolese, or the MNC. The MNC, in contrast with other Congolese liberation movements, did not champion any specific ethnic group. This is in contrast with political parties such as Joseph Kasavubu's Abako, which championed the Bakongo people. Lumumba, however, warned against ethnic separatism and promoted a platform of unity. The MNC wanted the complete and total independence of the Congo, Africa for the Africans. It was with this platform that Lumumba traveled to Accra, Ghana, to represent the Congolese people at the All-African People's Conference, organized by Ghana's first Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. The Gold Coast had fought its hard-won battle for independence against the British, achieving independence in 1957. It then renamed itself Ghana after the Ghana Empire. In the first election held in Ghana, Nkrumah's party, the Convention People's Party, won in a landslide. In his speech celebrating independence, Nkrumah emphasized his Pan-African beliefs. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
See, Nkrumah believed in the United States of Africa and wanted the political and economic integration of the African continent. This could have been influenced by the time that he spent in the United States. He spent 10 years in the United States and some of it studying at the University of Pennsylvania. The time he spent in the States, where he experienced the viciousness of American racism, good old American racism, this time strengthened his internationalist viewpoint. To Nkrumah, the struggle of African Americans against racism in the United States was connected with African liberation. And he wasn't the only one that thought that way. Martin Luther King, for example, was at Nkrumah's Independence Day speech. There, Martin Luther King reflected. He said, "At bottom, both segregation in America and colonialism in Africa are based on the same thing: white supremacy and contempt for life." Malcolm X agreed with Martin Luther King on this, amongst many other things that they agreed on. The American school system likes to pit the two against each other, but they were more similar than they were different.
The Organization of Afro-American Unity sees the only hope for the black man in America in a strong Africa, and the necessity of the Afro-American becoming inseparably linked with the overall program that's existing on the African continent. The two problems must be solved together, and the two forces must go forward together. And so the Organization of Afro-American Unity has a program to link the Afro-Americans with the Africans and the Africans with the Afro-Americans. When I say Afro-Americans, I mean those throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. This is our only hope. Our hope is in a strong Africa. And when Africa is strong, our position in America will be one of respect. But if Africa is weak, we will never be in a position of respect in America.
Nkrumah believed that it was only together that the African countries could fight off the pernicious influence of the West and achieve African liberation globally. The All-African People's Conference. It was because of this Pan-African belief that Nkrumah organized the AAPC, or the All-African People's Conference.
200 delegates to the All-African People's Conference heard a speech much to their liking by the Prime Minister of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He told them to aim at a United States of Africa to be formed on the model of the USA. A small beginning was already made by the Union of Ghana and Guinea. A subsequent speaker put it more crudely, saying, "Scram out of Africa." One of their slogans used the historic communist cry, "We have nothing to lose but our chains." Propaganda made use of modern techniques. The colored delegates came from 25 countries, African and Asian. The Kremlin sent 7 Russians among the observers. Africans criticized some of their own institutions, "Down with tribalism" being one of the slogans. Delegates from Kenya demanded the release of a Mau Mau leader, Jomo Kenyatta. A lighter note was struck by the Senegalese delegate in what the well-dressed tribesman should wear. Quite a thought-provoking conference.
The All-African People's Conference was teeming with notable intellectuals such as Frantz Fanon, who fought in the Algerian War for Independence and also wrote foundational texts such as Black Skin, White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth, as well as George Padmore, a Trinidadian leading Pan-Africanist. Delegates from all over the world were in attendance, including the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. The United States, however, did not attend. When Vice President Richard Nixon was alerted that the Americans' lack of attendance looked bad, he sent a telegram, which did not arrive in time and was never read. Call that divine intervention. This was an opportunity for the newly liberated African countries to come together and chart a course for their collective future. Nkrumah spoke about the challenges that the new African countries would face. Although they were independent in name, the old colonial empires were not ready to give up their economic monopolies just yet. No doubt, the enemies that Nkrumah described were at the very conference that he had organized in order to chart the path forward. And when he said that such influences would also come from outside of Europe, he was no doubt aware that the AAPC had already become a battleground for African sovereignty. You know how I said that the United States wasn't there? Well, the formal United States government wasn't there. The CIA was there. The conference was crawling with spies from the CIA, watching to see how African politics could be in the interests of American foreign policy. In fact, the FBI had been following Nkrumah since he was at the University of Pennsylvania under suspicion of being a communist. Now, the presence of another American intelligence bureau was felt at the AAPC. A brief history of the CIA in Africa. If I asked you what was the extent of CIA activity in Africa after World War II, what would you say? Why would the CIA be in Africa, you ask? Why indeed? The presence of American intelligence services in the Congo dates back to at least World War II. There was an Africa section in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA. By the end of World War II, there were 93 American special agents in Africa who had a top-secret mission: to protect the export of one crucial element that could be found in abundance in the Congo: uranium. Why do we need uranium, you may ask? Well, uranium is needed for nuclear weapons. Yep, I mean it's needed for nuclear weapons, so you can imagine. Uranium is needed for nuclear weapons, which made the Congolese ore essential for the Manhattan Project. George Padmore wrote in the Chicago Defender, "Africa holds the key to a nuclear future. The world's uranium supply is there." And he was right! However, there was a concerted effort to hide the knowledge that there was uranium in the Congo. The idea was if the Soviets were to find out the source of the American uranium, they would get it themselves. And this was during the Cold War. So during the Cold War, anytime you ask yourself, why did the American government do this? You can answer it with the Soviets. Why did we get involved in the Vietnam War? The Soviets. Why did we go to Korea? The Soviets. Why did we bomb Japan? The Soviets. At least that's what they claim. The key mine in the Congo used to mine uranium was the Shinkolobwe mine in the region of Katanga. It is from the Shinkolobwe mine that the uranium used in the warheads that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki was found. Everything is connected. Exploit Africans at home to further imperialism and mass death abroad. USA! 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 And it wasn't just the uranium that the Americans were worried about. By 1959, about 9% of the world's copper, 49% of the world's cobalt, 69% of the world's industrial diamonds, and 6.5% of the world's tin came from the Congo. This will come into play later. This is just a small aside, but this is why when I was studying politics in college, I would get so annoyed when people were talking about Africa, and in reference they would talk about the resource curse theory, which, if you don't know, the resource curse theory is this idea that why is it that countries that have so many resources aren't able to succeed even though they're so mineral rich? And it's like, cool. CIA-backed coup, CIA-inspired dictatorship, coup. That's the answer. That's the answer, because if your country has minerals, the CIA is coming for you. And the Americans were hell-bent on making sure that all of these resources stayed under American control. So what do you think is going to happen to the leader who says the resources of the Congo should be used for the people of the Congo? Intelligence agencies at home. The FBI was making great efforts on the home front to undermine Black liberation movements. As we know, they launched COINTELPRO, which was a series of covert and illegal projects conducted between 1956 and 1971 by the US FBI aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations that the FBI perceived as subversive. Activities included killing Black Panther leader George Hampton and spying on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. The CIA, the FBI, the intelligence services were also somewhat involved within the death of Malcolm X, which is just being brought up again now because it appears that they collaborated with the police and hid some evidence, you know, typical FBI stuff. But the CIA was not to be outdone. It was important to use a combination of both hard power and soft power to solidify American hegemony. Hard power is military might versus soft power, which is diplomacy, cultural exports, that kind of thing. Twice! What is love? The CIA created and funded multiple different organizations, such as the American Society for African Culture, the African American Institute, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The CIA also worked with publishers to support the publication of certain books. I'm not accusing anybody, but I think that some of you CIA-sponsored girlies are in the syllabus for some of my courses. I'm not accusing anybody. I'm not accusing anybody. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. I'm not accusing anybody, but some of you CIA-sponsored girlies are on the syllabus. You know who I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of you, Samuel Huntington, Francis Fukuyama. I would not be surprised if you guys were being funded by the CIA, or if you were funded. My mistake, please. For example, over 1,000 books were published by a publisher called Frederick A. Prager, which worked closely with the CIA during the 1950s and 60s. In the book Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War, British historian Francis Saunders described how the CIA supported the creation of two films, 1984 and Animal Farm. You probably read those books in school, didn't you? I did. Every American does. Wonder why that is. Nonprofits like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Foundation all passed money from the CIA to the nonprofits such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Problems in Francophone Africa. There are problems in Francophone Africa? Remember when I said that France let African countries vote on whether or not they wanted to be independent? Well, that's not exactly how it happened. On September 28, 1958, de Gaulle called for a referendum in all Francophone countries in Africa. He gave them a choice between self-government or remaining as members of the French community. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. Any nation which chose self-government would be completely cut off from French economic aid. One such nation was Guinea. Guinea was the only French colony to vote against remaining in the French community and for self-government. The reaction was swift. They were quick with it. They did not waste a minute. Nary a minute was wasted. An American officer working at a U.S. embassy in Guinea recalled, "They pulled out all of their people. They ripped out the electrical wires for the street lighting, for the apartment buildings and offices, broke down the generators of the local hospitals, tore up the sheets. I mean, everything you can think of, they did. It was horrible. They broke the elevator to the one skyscraper, which was just mean and vicious, and it was ugly, and the country had not been able to overcome that. It was readily apparent. I mean, holes in the streets, broken down lights. They broke things and the cranes. I mean, you just name it. They broke it. I mean, they were determined to teach that country a lesson. And they did. You know what it reminds me of reading that? That scene in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, where it's like, he took the who's-its and the what's-its, he took the crumb. He took the crumb from under the fridge, he took the two-eyed beast and the one-eyed feast and the whatever.
He took the who's feast. He took the who pudding. He took the roast beast. He cleaned out the icebox as quick as a flash. Why, that Grinch even took the last can of who hash.
That is the French right there. The Grinch stealing from all the who's, that's the French, and that's Guinea. They pulled out the electrical wires. Guys, do you know how they pulled out the electrical wires? And yet the first president of Guinea, Ahmed Sékou Touré, held fast. Guinea prefers poverty in freedom to riches in slavery. Well said. Although France's withdrawal brought Guinea to the brink of economic collapse, Guinea was able to stay afloat with the help of another West African country, Ghana. Nkrumah loaned $28 million to Guinea, an example of Pan-African policy in practice. Meanwhile, in the Belgian Congo, Belgian families choked on their coffee when they heard de Gaulle's speech on the radio. This did not bode well for the Belgian Congo state. You see other people getting freedom, you think, why can't we get freedom? And then all of a sudden everybody wants freedom. Only a few weeks later, the MNC, Mouvement National Congolais, was established, with Lumumba as chairman. The All-African People's Conference continued. Lumumba met Nkrumah for the first time at the All-African People's Conference in 1958. Lumumba was actually introduced to Nkrumah by George Padmore. The two immediately struck a friendship. At the AAPC, the question of violence was discussed. What is the question of violence? The question of violence is, should we use it? The idea behind the question of violence is it okay to use violence as a means in order to achieve just political goals? So for example, if you are being oppressed by a colonial occupying force, is it okay to use violence? And if it is okay to use violence, who is it okay to use violence against? Against all civilians? Against soldiers? In certain contexts? If you think that it isn't okay to use violence in any kind of circumstance, historical examples that would point to the usefulness of violence within a political context would even be the United States Revolutionary War. Evidently, violence was used to free the 13 colonies from the British. But then there's the question of what is just violence versus unjust violence. Many different groups have used terrorism as a way to achieve their ends in just and unjust ways, and unfortunately, a lot of groups were called terrorists, such as the Mau Mau in Kenya, for fighting for their independence and rightfully rejecting the occupying forces under which they were oppressed. I don't have the answers. I just like to ask the questions. Nkrumah supported nonviolence. He had been inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's commitment to nonviolence as a way to achieve independence in India from the British. Lumumba shared these sentiments. If you know anything about Frantz Fanon, you know that he did not. He did not share those sentiments. I think that this was largely due to his background with the FLN, Front Libération Nationale, which fought in the war against France for Algerian independence. The French had been torturing Algerians for fighting for their independence, so I think that that context definitely influenced Fanon's ideas about violence and when and if it was necessary. Fanon gave a speech at the conference talking about the limitations of nonviolence as a means for attaining independence. He advocated for African countries to be able to fight back against their oppressors when necessary, as he was doing with the FLN, to firmly state that Algeria was, in fact, not France. France does this thing where the colonies, they're not even the colonies. It's like, this is just France. Algeria, this is just France. There are some kind of colonizing powers that don't look at it kind of that way. They're like, this is, you know, this is us and this is you guys and we're controlling you guys, but it's not like that territory is like Britain or whatever. But France, no, they're like, this is France. Everything is France. Fanon's speech electrified the conference. The question of violence against even oppressors was hotly debated. Ultimately, the committee resolved to support all those who resort to peaceful means of nonviolence and civil disobedience, as well as all those who are compelled to retaliate against violence to attain national independence and freedom for the people. Where such retaliation becomes necessary, the conference condemns all legislation which considers those who fight for independence and freedom as ordinary criminals. The CIA at the All-African Peoples Conference. As I said earlier, the United States did not attend the All-African Peoples Conference, yet its presence was felt. In fact, the CIA spied on Lumumba at the AAPC by sending an agent to interpret for him. Lumumba spoke French and Nkrumah spoke English, so the agent was able to interpret between the two. So this agent translated the meeting between Lumumba and Nkrumah, as well as the meeting that Lumumba had with the Soviet delegates. They were watching closely as Lumumba talked with Frantz Fanon, who they had been trailing in Algeria. You have to understand, it's not like Lumumba was an idiot and he didn't suspect that there would be some type of espionage going on. Rather, he thought that the espionage would be coming from a Belgian or a European. He actually distrusted Europeans much more than Americans because of, one, the fact that the United States was a former colony itself, and two, the fact that the United States did not technically have any colonies in Africa. You know, the United States didn't always have the reputation that it has today of invading countries and killing democratically elected leaders. At the time, from the African perspective, the United States was a welcome change from the old colonial powers of Europe. Why not take the evil that you don't know over the evil that you already know? Because the United States was a former colony, many African leaders and Africans thought that it represented freedom and democracy. Lumumba would change this view towards the end of his life. The CIA had set up a dedicated Africa division in 1959 within the Directorate of Plans, which was a special department for clandestine operations. The director of the CIA at the time was a man called Allen Dulles, who oversaw multiple coups d'etats all over the world. Oh, the coup d'etat heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The CIA chief of station in the Congo was Larry Devlin, who had been recruited from Harvard University, which had been described as having a cozy relationship with the CIA over the years. This is why I can't help but laugh when conservatives are like, liberal universities, they're turning our children into communists, because it's like, no. They're turning your children into CIA agents to fight the communists. There were concerns in Washington about the direction that the newly independent African countries were taking. At a national security meeting on January 14, 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower reviewed the U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. CIA Director Dulles asserted that the chances in Africa of orderly economic development and economic progress towards self-determination were just about nil. President Eisenhower was in agreement with this conjecture. Vice President Nixon seemed to think that that much was obvious, adding that some of the peoples of Africa have been out of the trees for only about 50 years. You're telling me Richard Nixon was racist? Rooted in paternalism and American foreign policy interests, the council decided that they needed to invest in strong men in Africa and, if need be, create those strong men themselves. Henry Kissinger, burn in hell, when he said that the West needs nothing more than men who can create their own reality, that's what these girls are doing. And obviously, I mean, come on, Nixon and Kissinger? Nixinger, guys? Nixinger, legends, duo, OTP, come on. This makes complete sense from their perspective. That's the American foreign policy. Create your own reality. Now, this was an obvious contradiction with the United States policy at the time and currently of supporting democracies around the world. That's why they didn't say it out loud. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The rise of Lumumba. When Lumumba returned to the Congo from the AAPC in Ghana, it was with a renewed sense of hope and unity for the African continent. Immediately, he got to work organizing for Congolese independence.
Patrice Lumumba, vous êtes leader du MNC, du mouvement national congolais. Quels sont les objectifs de ce mouvement?
Nous poursuivons 3 objectifs bien précis. Le premier objectif, c'est grouper tous les Congolais sans distinction des tribus, des races, des classes ou des religions en vue de réaliser l'unité nationale du pays. Deuxième objectif, c'est initier les Congolais à la vie politique. Et le troisième objectif, c'est réaliser l'indépendance du Congo et constituer un État démocratique moderne, assurant à tous les citoyens le bien-être, la paix sociale et la liberté.
2 weeks after the conference, Lumumba's party, the MNC, organized a mass rally in Leopoldville. 10,000 people filled the streets to hear Lumumba speak. He demanded immediate independence. A week later, on January 4th, 1959, riots broke out in Leopoldville. The other Congolese leader for independence, Joseph Kasavubu, and his party, the Abako, were planning on holding their own political rally. Kasavubu was concerned that Lumumba was gaining ground as the face of Congolese independence, so he set out to hold a rally in the exact same place that the MNC had held theirs. However, when the crowds arrived, they were told that their rally had been prohibited by the colonial administration. They were furious and began to protest, which angered the colonial army, which shot into the crowd. The riot continued for 4 days, ultimately killing at least 500 people. In response to the riots, the Belgian government cracked down on the Congo. Kasavubu and other Abako leaders were jailed, and Belgian settlers were panicking. They had been previously led to believe that their grip on the Congo was ironclad, and recent events were demonstrating that, in fact, it was not. So the government needed to act quickly. In reaction to these riots and the political situation in the Congo disintegrating rapidly, King Baudouin, the King of Belgium, promised independence. Eventually. In the meantime, the Belgian government decided that there would be increased representation at the local level. That's something. In March of 1959, Lumumba traveled to Ibadan, Nigeria, in order to attend a conference on representative government and national progress. He went alongside Cyril Adula, a moderate, strongly anti-communist liberal who was a fellow founder of the MNC. Before leaving for Ibadan, Lumumba spoke to his friend, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who was soon leaving for Belgium for an internship. Mobutu met with the U.S. ambassador to Belgium, Ambassador Bill Burden. Simultaneously, Mobutu acted as an informer for CIA agent-in-chief of station in the Congo, Larry Devlin. Susan Williams writes, "There was widespread suspicion of Mobutu in Congolese circles. It was widely believed that he had been an informer in the pay of the Belgians from the late 1950s. Lumumba was warned that Mobutu was working as an informer, yet Lumumba responded that he was already aware of this and that it was an innocent way for Mobutu to bring in some extra income. Lumumba knew personally the difficulties of financial hardship, but he also had developed a dangerously soft spot for Mobutu. Long before independence, the CIA had assessed Congolese politicians, trying to size them up and see which of them would be most amenable to American influence. Joseph Désiré Mobutu, or Mobutu Sese Seko as he was known later in life, was one of these strong men that the white man decided to cultivate. I mean, that's true. The white man decided to cultivate him. If you don't want to be African, just say that. If you don't want to be African, just say that. Mobutu was one of the strong men that the White House decided to support. The mnc-l and mnc-k. Meanwhile, in the Congo, the Belgians were not keeping their promise to increase local representation. In July 1959, there was a schism in the MNC. The MNC split into two factions, the mnc-k under Albert Kalanji and the mnc-l under Lumumba. Kalanji was from the same province as Lumumba, the Kasai province, which was known for its industrial diamonds. Alongside Kalanji was Joseph Ilio and Lumumba's former friend, Adula Cyril. The two former friends' relationship had ruptured due to political infighting. But Lumumba was not deterred. He spoke frequently with Kwame Nkrumah to ask advice in the struggle for Congolese independence. He was a gifted orator, and he spoke at length in public about the injustices that the Congolese had faced under Belgian rule. This did not resonate with the Belgians. Essentially, Lumumba was becoming a real nuisance for them. He was going around speaking at any time that he wanted about the crimes that Belgium had committed against the Congolese. He was wildly popular, and he was shouting, "Independence now." Not yesterday, not tomorrow, independence now. From the Belgian perspective, it was his fault that people were rioting in Leopoldville. That's really an interesting thought process. And the Belgian administration decided that they were going to do something about it. On October 30th, 1959, the Belgian colonial forces attempted to arrest Lumumba at a rally. I say attempted because their efforts were thwarted by throngs of people that were there to support Lumumba and to support the mnc-l. The police eventually gave up, but not before killing 30 people and wounding another 100. A warrant for Lumumba's arrest was issued. On what grounds, you might ask? Inciting a disturbance. It's law and order. On November 1st of the same year, he was arrested for inciting a disturbance and sent to a prison in Stanleyville. As you would expect, this heightened tensions. The people were not happy about this, and when King Baudouin made his visit to Stanleyville, he was surrounded by angry crowds yelling, "Free Lumumba." The people! The people! The Belgian government finally decided to make good on their earlier promise to chart the path towards independence. In January of 1960, there was a round table in Brussels, including the representatives of the different Congolese political parties, the mnc-k and the mnc-l, in order to discuss the economic and political dimensions of independence. There was just a small problem. On the first day of the round table, Lumumba was still in prison. The Congolese leaders demanded his immediate release, insisting that he was a key voice in the fight for independence. Even Kasavubu spoke in Lumumba's favor. Instead of releasing Lumumba, the Belgians decided to transfer him to a maximum security prison. Lumumba wrote this telegram to his lawyer. Was transferred Jadoville under hideous circumstances, thrown on plane, barefoot, shirtless, handcuffed, and physically assaulted till arrived on board. Torture continues, all my possessions remain, prison Stanleyville, and no change shirt. Meanwhile, in Brussels, the Congolese politicians refused to participate in the talks without Lumumba. The Belgians had no choice but to acquiesce. The same day that Lumumba was transferred to the maximum security prison, he was released and driven to the airport. There he was met with 10,000 Congolese shouting, "Down with colonialism, down with the colonialists, long live immediate independence." Life comes at you fast. Yesterday, not even yesterday, today, this morning, you were in a maximum security prison. Now you're a freedom fighter. The Round Table.
Brussels Palace of Congress, the opening session of the Belgian-Congolese Round Table. The conference's goal is to define, between Congolese and Belgians, ways to practically organize the exercise of Congolese independence according to democratic principles, African aspirations, general interests of Congo, and the future contributions Belgium-Congo, with 44 Congolese delegates representing the various indigenous parties proportionally, and 20 Belgian parliamentary delegates representing our three traditional parties will thus define whether the Prime Minister is capable of doing it. Together look for recommendations to present to our parliaments.
But guess who is already in Brussels? That's right, Mobutu. He was there for the internship in Belgium, remember? And while Mobutu had been in Brussels, he was appointed as the mnc-l's representative there. When Lumumba's plane landed in Brussels, Mobutu was front and center, yelling in the crowd, "Vive Lumumba, vive le MNC." Bitch, fucking bitch, fuck you, little telltale rat! He actually wrote out, "Long live Lumumba and long live the MNC" on a hotel sheet. He put this up at the hotel that the Congolese delegates were staying in. Here is the picture. Lumumba's room was small, furnished sparsely with 2 plain beds. Kasavubu, however, was furnished in style. South African journalist Colin Legum noted that, unlike Lumumba's room, Kasavubu's was large and elegantly decorated in Regency red and white striped wallpaper with satin curtains and coverings. Once Lumumba actually made it to the Round Table, things began to progress quickly. The Congolese delegates were united in demanding independence within 6 months. Ultimately, they reached an agreement that Congo would become independent on June 30th, 1960, only 5 months after the Round Table. Now, it was time to establish the political and economic structure of the state of the Congo. It was decided that elections would be held May of 1960. The delegates were overjoyed. Only a few days before, Lumumba was being held in a Belgian prison. Now, he was leading the Congolese to independence. But their joy would be short-lived. The negotiations over the Congo's economic future were asymmetrical. On the Congolese side were university students and recent graduates, whereas on the Belgian side were seasoned, prominent experts. Some of the Belgian delegates had even been the professors of some of the members of the Congolese delegates. George Nzingola Natalaja, permanent representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo to the United Nations, describes it like this. Negotiating with such young, inexperienced, and politically insignificant delegates who needed Belgian expertise to make sense of the complex issues at stake, the Belgians laid the groundwork for the third rape of the Congo, economically speaking, the first and second one having taken place under King Leopold II and the colonial state, respectively. The Belgians cynically used the resolutions of the conference to privatize the enormous state portfolios in major colonial trusts and transfer these assets to Belgium. They also allowed many private companies operating in the Congo to transfer their headquarters to Belgium, thus denying the new state a large amount of tax income, while leaving to it virtually all the public debt. So, not only had these colonies been pillaged for decades, their economic resources exploited, the people killed. Think about the demographic implications of the genocide that occurred within the Congo, where almost 50% of the population was murdered, died of famine, etc., and the economic implications that that would have in the future. That's what people should consider when they're thinking about, in terms of responsibility for the current situation in Africa, where the blame should be put. Yes, it is true that ultimately Africans have the responsibility for Africa, and it's Africans that will change the situation in Africa. At the same time, it would be remiss to ignore the context. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? The context of the African political situation today and the kind of intervention that happened during the colonial period is not over. The problem is that even when African countries attempt to exercise their agency, they are sabotaged. And we'll talk about the ways in which the Congo will be sabotaged in its efforts to exercise its agency over its own resources and its people. Nzingola Natalaja says that the Belgians allowed the Congolese to think that they were operating in good faith because they were confident that their continued presence in the Congo would protect and advance their interests. As they saw it, they would remain associated with state power through the army and through the government, the judiciary, the civil service, and state enterprises. Neo-colonialism, everybody! So, independence, kind of. This is what neo-colonialism is, okay? So, we had colonialism. Some people will say, it was forever ago, like, get over it. Why are y'all still talking about colonialism? Because it's still happening. Because it's still happening through economic means. Ambassador Bill Burden. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were not going to miss out on any piece of the Congolese pie. U.S. Ambassador to Belgium, Ambassador William Bill Burden, was keeping a close eye on the developments in the Congo. Ambassador Burden was an heir to the Vanderbilt fortune. He had made sizable contributions to the Republican Party in 1956 in hopes that he would be chosen for the esteemed role of American ambassador in France. Can we talk about what's wrong with that sentence? So he made sizable contributions to a political party in hopes that he would get a public service post. But that wasn't gonna happen. To Burden's dismay, he got ambassador to Belgium instead. You know, he longed for the Parisian life, but it wasn't in the cards for him. In his own granddaughter's memoir, Dead End Gene Pool, Burden is described as a casual anti-Semite and an alcoholic. Within domestic American politics, Burden advocated for the use of nuclear weapons under the Eisenhower administration, as well as the use of biological weapons. He had a great deal of financial interests, including within the Congo. During his tenure as ambassador, he was also the director of American Metal Climax, a mining company. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Hey fellas, should it be legal for a public servant to hold positions on a board of a company that they're forming policy for? Sound off in the comments below! Sounds like a conflict of interest to me. To me. American Metal Climax was linked to the Belgian Congo, and more specifically, the Shinkolowobe mine. But Ambassador Burton wasn't the only member of the Eisenhower administration that had financial interests in the Congo. Another was Christian A. Herter, the Secretary of State, who had family ties to Mobil Oil with direct investments in the Congo. C. Douglas Dillon, the Undersecretary of State, had family ties to Dillon, Reed and Company, which had managed the Belgian Congo's bond issues. Thomas Gates, the Secretary of Defense, had ties to Drexel and Company and to Morgan Guaranty Trust, which had managed two $20 million loans to the Belgian Congo. But back to Ambassador Burton. Burton also had ties to the CIA. He described CIA Director Allen Dulles as a lifelong friend. Allen Dulles also had personal ties to the American Metal Climax Company, as it had actually helped the CIA fund the aforementioned African American Institute, the CIA Front. It's crazy how these things are connected. I mean, the CIA working with the Department of State to fund nonprofits that are supposed to be impartial, but that are actually spreading the CIA-backed message of whatever they want, of liberal democracy, girl. I don't know. This is the most American thing ever. It is the private sector collaborating with the public sector against the interests of the people. In March of 1960, Ambassador Burton traveled to the Congo with his wife, Peggy. He was met by CIA Chief of Station in the Congo, Larry Devlin. Where are you? There he is. Larry. Good old Larry. Devlin wrote in his memoir, Chief of Station Congo, that Soviet control of the Congo would give the Soviet Union a near monopoly on the production of cobalt, a critical mineral used in missiles and many other weapons systems, since the Congo and the USSR were the world's main suppliers of the mineral. He says cobalt here, but that could have been a code word for uranium. During World War II, Congolese uranium ore was packaged in barrels that said special cobalt. They were trying to keep the fact that the Congo had uranium under wraps. They did not want that shit coming out. Larry Devlin met Lumumba at the Round Table in Brussels. According to Devlin's report to Washington on the meeting, it was hate at first sight. On Larry Devlin's end, Lumumba had affection for the Americans at the time. Devlin also met with Mobutu, who was serving him as an informer at the time. Ambassador Burton didn't have any friendlier inclinations towards Lumumba. He described his feelings towards Lumumba as such. Lumumba was such a damn nuisance, it was perfectly obvious that the way to get rid of him was through political assassination. Ambassador Burton believed that Lumumba was working with the Soviets, or rather, working for them. There isn't evidence that the latter is true, but the Americans would soon invent some. Create your own reality. But Ambassador Burton wasn't the only one who felt that way. Belgium had been discussing plans to assassinate Lumumba since at least March of 1960. Well, duh. He was fucking their money up. Ambassador Burton wrote that the Belgians were sort of toying with the idea of seeing to it that Lumumba was assassinated. Just sort of toying with the idea, guys. Calm down, guys. We're just sort of toying with the idea. The Congolese elections. As promised, the elections in Congo took place in May of 1960. Voter turnout was substantial, at almost 82%, although women were still not allowed to vote. Lumumba's MNC had the largest share of the votes, with 33 out of 137 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. In contrast, Kasavubu's party won 12 seats. The mnc-k, which included the people that had split off from Lumumba's MNC, so Albert Kalonji and Cyril Adula, won 8 seats. However, no single party had enough votes to govern on its own, therefore a unity party was proposed which would combine two of the political parties to govern. The Belgians were not happy about the result of this election. To see Lumumba's popularity when they had put so much money into funding opposing parties was a blow. So the Belgian government, with the support of King Baudouin, urged Kasavubu to form a coalition government with other minority parties. This angered Lumumba, and he responded that, in accordance with democratic principles, it is the MNC, the party which won more votes than any other in the elections, that should form the government. He added that the Belgian government and the royal palace are absolutely determined to keep the MNC out of power. They are now urging minority groups to form a coalition of artificial bases so as to appoint a puppet government, which I swear the people will reject tomorrow if these maneuvers behind the scenes succeed. And reject it they did. Kasavubu was defeated not one, not two, but 3 times running in the Chamber of Deputies. In contrast, the mnc-l succeeded in forming a coalition government. The Belgian government and King Baudouin had no choice but to accept Lumumba as prime minister. As prime minister, Lumumba nominated none other than Joseph Désiré Mobutu as Secretary of State. This action will have consequences. He chose a friend and a fellow member of the mnc-l, Antoine Gizinga, as Deputy Prime Minister. Nkrumah, watching the democracy of the Congo unfold from Accra, urged Lumumba to find a place in his government for Kasavubu, on the grounds that the Bakongo people could not be ignored. Hence, Kasavubu became the head of state with Joseph Ilio as the president of the Senate. This action will have consequences. The CIA in Africa. Ilio was not the only one. Kenyan Washington Akumu was also approached by CIA asset Howard Embry for information on African leaders. Akumu describes his relationship with the American intelligence agency. When you are CIA, you don't stop. That is the time when you are the most useful to them, so they will be at your tail every 5 minutes. You can assume they were under my bed. The Americans were everywhere. Akumu was a small part in a larger operation outlined in a CIA paper called CIA Position in Belgian Congo RE Political Action Operations. The paper reads, the role of the CIA in the Belgian Congo during the period prior to 30th June 1960 should be to ensure that U.S. aims for the area, both the Congo and the other parts of the continent whose relationship with the Congo will affect our aims, can be implemented. The aims in question were, number 1, ensuring a government that was friendly to the West, and number 2, combating Soviet influence. So Howard Embry's role was to get money into the hands of Western-friendly Congolese politicians and groups. A little bit of political bribery, if you will. So when Washington learned that their efforts had borne fruit and CIA-backed Joseph Ilio had made it to the President of the Senate, they were overjoyed. At a meeting of the National Security Council, the Deputy Director of the CIA, Charles P. Cable, expressed his satisfaction at this turn of events, stating, "We may have secured some influence with this potentially useful individual." Independence Day. On Independence Day, June 30th, 1960, the Congolese people were freed after decades of colonial rule.
The wind of change blowing through the Belgian Congo, and down comes the Belgian flag in Leopoldville, a few days in fact in advance of independence. Elected as Prime Minister of the new Congo Republic, Mr. Patrice Lumumba receives congratulations from members of both Houses of Parliament. He himself emphasized that the Republic intended to work in close friendship with Belgium. So one more African country becomes a sovereign state. And in the capital, its flags fly from the many fine modern buildings, now legacies from Belgian rule. King Baudouin of the Belgians had accepted an invitation to attend the celebrations, but long before he arrived, celebrations were being prepared.
King Baudouin flew to Leopoldville to speak at the ceremony. This is the speech. You have to see it for yourself or you won't believe it.
L'indépendance du Congo constitue l'aboutissement de l'œuvre conçue par le génie du roi Léopold II, que le Congo accède ce 30 juin 1960 en plein accord et amitié avec la Belgique à l'indépendance et à la souveraineté internationale.
May God protect the Congo indeed. May he protect it from you and your cronies. So this speech was not well received. King Leopold II, the Congolese Hitler, who was responsible for the deaths of millions of Congolese people, that wasn't gonna fly. You can actually see Lumumba in his seat, clearly irritated, furiously writing down notes during the king's speech. Kasavubu gave a speech that nobody gave a fuck about, that was, very, yes, why can't we be friends, everybody, whatever. Then Lumumba rose and gave his message to the Congolese people.
When Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba took the stage, he made sure to challenge the king's perspective and prevent him from having the final say.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté. Nous avons connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres. Qui oubliera qu'à un noir, on disait tu, non certes comme à un ami, mais parce que les vous honorables étaient réservés aux seuls blancs. Il y a beaucoup souffert dans notre corps, dans notre respect de l'oppression colonialiste. Nous vous le disons, tout cela est désormais fini.
King Baudouin was displeased with Lumumba's speech.
The king was incensed by this speech. He wanted to leave not just the hall, but the whole country of the Congo and go back to Belgium. Good, bitch. Stay in Belgium. This legendary speech would go on to inspire activist Malcolm X, who said that you should take that speech and tack it up over your door. This is what Lumumba said. You aren't giving us anything. Why, can you take back these scars that you put on your bodies? Can you give us back the limbs that you cut off while you were here? Both men knew the vitriol of anti-black governance and were united in one struggle for liberation. In 1964, Malcolm X spoke on the situation in the Congo, saying that the basic most cause of most of the trouble in the Congo right now is the intervention of outsiders. The fighting that is going on over the mineral wealth of the Congo and over the strategic position that the Congo represents on the African continent. And in order to justify it, they are doing it at the expense of the Congolese by trying to make it appear that the people are savages. And I think, as one of the gentlemen mentioned earlier, if there are savages in the Congo, then there are worse savages in Mississippi, Alabama, and New York City, and probably some in Washington, D.C. too. An independent Congo, Nkrumah, back in Ghana, worked tirelessly to help the new Congolese nation. Ghana opened an embassy in the independent Congo, and Nkrumah appointed Andrew Ginn as Ghana's ambassador to the Congo. The Ghanaian government sent doctors, nurses, electricians, engineers, and civil servants to aid the new nation. Lumumba's meteoric rise in popularity was described by Swiss journalist François Bondy, who remarked that whenever Lumumba went somewhere, his journey lasts many hours, since in every village the inhabitants throw trees in the road, block the route, and refuse to let him go until he has made a speech. I thought that this was funny. Speech! 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 They're throwing trees in the road. They're cutting down trees to get this guy to speak. You think anybody would throw trees in the road to hear Joe Biden speak? Ghana. At the time of the All-African Peoples Conference in 1958, there were only 9 independent countries across the whole of Africa. But in 1960 alone, 17 African nations became independent. Within Ghana, Nkrumah was working to improve the material conditions of his people. Williams notes that teacher training enrollment increased from 1,916 in 1951 to 4,552 in 1961, an increase of 137.5%. University students in that period increased from 208 to 1,204. The number of hospital beds went up from 2,368 to 6,155. Gravel roads increased by nearly 60%. Telephones increased by over 345%. I don't know if this argument is worthy of addressing, but there are some people in the world who truly believe that colonialism was of benefit to African countries. I know it's hard to believe, but they exist. I've spoken to some of them. And for anybody who is under that wrong impression, I suggest the book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney and the video that I made on it. Plug. A little bit of self-promotion never killed anybody. Nkrumah also diversified the Ghanaian economy, which during the colonial period had been entirely dependent on one crop, cocoa. That's another thing that the colonialism was of benefit to African countries people seem not to understand, is that the African economies were geared entirely towards export, and there were some African countries like Senegal that the entire economy was based on peanuts. Nkrumah's government invested in oil, agriculture, and factories, causing Ghana's GDP to increase 24.5% from 1960 to 1965. U.S.-Ghana relations, however, soured when the Americans realized that Nkrumah was providing such substantial support to freedom movements across the continent, but also to Lumumba's MNC. But that wasn't the Americans' only problem with Nkrumah. They were also unnerved by his interest in nuclear power. Nkrumah was staunchly against the use of nuclear weapons and extensively criticized France's nuclear weapons testing program in the Sahara. However, he supported the transition to nuclear energy and to this end tried to get a nuclear reactor for Ghana. At first, Nkrumah asked Canada for help in obtaining a reactor, as Canada had helped India obtain one. But under pressure from the United States, Canada declined. Nkrumah then turned to the Soviet Union, which not only provided him with a reactor, but also sent over technicians. Mind you, at the same time that the United States was sabotaging Ghana's efforts to get a nuclear reactor, they were helping apartheid South Africa obtain one. So a condition for having nuclear power in the eyes of the United States government under the Eisenhower administration was either having a white minority rule government or being a predominantly white country. Well, it appears that way anyway. The United States also turned a blind eye to the Israelis trying to get nukes, but that's neither here nor there. But if you're interested, you can check out my video on the US-Israel relationship. Gotta get that promo in. And stuff in these YouTube streets, guys. The Congo crisis. On July 5th, 1960, only a week after independence, a crisis broke out. It began with a mutiny in the army, the Force Publique. The Congolese soldiers felt that nothing had substantially changed for them before and after independence. All the officers were still white Belgians, and the pay was still the same. As a result of the mutiny, Belgian civilians fled by the thousands. On July 10th, Belgium sent 10,000 troops to the Congo under the guise of protecting Belgian civilians. This was illegal, of course, because the Congo was an independent nation. The United Nations Charter had long ruled that member states develop amicable and tolerant relations based on non-intervention in the internal affairs of the states. But as usual, nobody gives a fuck about international law. I'm sorry, it's true, no one cares. I got examples out the wazoo, like, you can understand how alarming this invasion was to the Congolese. I mean, they had only been independent for like a week and already the Belgians were back. Because of Lumumba's, quite frankly, misplaced faith in the American government, he turned to the US in asking for assistance to remove the Belgian troops from the Congo. They said no. Yeah, I saw that one coming. They said no. And they told Lumumba that he should go through the UN. So Lumumba went to the UN, bastion of freedom and justice. This is important. Remember that Lumumba appealed to the United States for military assistance in removing the Belgians from the Congo, and they declined. So when Lumumba turned to the UN and asked for assistance, UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjold convened an immediate meeting of the Security Council. On July 14th, a resolution passed calling Belgium to remove all of its troops. They did not do that. The resolution also called for the UN to provide military assistance to the Congo. Over the next 2 weeks, 13,000 UN troops, called Blue Hats or Blue Buckets, casque bleu because they wear blue hats, landed in the Congo, cheered on by the population. Meanwhile, Lumumba and Kasavubu and their unity government were hard at work trying to appease the mutinying army. They promised better conditions and promoted Congolese soldiers. Lumumba also gave Mobutu the rank of lieutenant colonel. Antoine Gizinga, Lumumba's deputy prime minister, objected immediately on the grounds that Mobutu was a threat to national security. Yes, Gizinga, somebody needs to say it. How is this man still allowed to be in a government when it is well known that he is acting as an informer for not just the Americans, but the Belgians as well? It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. Once Mobutu had the rank of lieutenant colonel, he did absolutely nothing to actually address the concerns of the disgruntled soldiers. The man, the myth, the legend, Antoine Gizinga, actually tried to replace Mobutu while he was away from the Congo. This didn't work because when Mobutu came back to the Congo, he went crying to Lumumba, who gave him back his position. This can't be! This just can't be! Lumumba told Gizinga to try to be more understanding. Nkrumah took action from Ghana, sending soldiers to support the UN forces. But little did he know that there were snakes in his own government. Major General Henry Templar Alexander was a white British general that served as Ghana's chief of defense. General Alexander had been a general within the British Army before Ghanaian independence. Alexander held deeply racist ideas about Africans, stating that life to the African is of much less value than to the European. A word? He would cause a series of problems during the Congo crisis. The first problem that Alexander caused in the Congo was that as soon as he got there, he disarmed the ANC troops. The ANC troops were the Congolese troops that were mutinying. So he took their guns. This left the Congo completely open to Belgian occupation with no means of defense. Lumumba was appalled by this, and so was UN Secretary General Hammarskjold. Nkrumah's ambassador to the Congo, Jin, wrote to him explaining and warning him of Alexander's subversive behavior. Back in the Congo, Lumumba and Kasavubu were still working to try to get the Belgians out of the Congo. Lumumba, backed into a wall, sent an ultimatum to the United Nations. Either get the Belgians out, or we are calling the Soviets. This is what sent Ambassador Burden over the edge, causing him to make his first official recommendation for the overthrow of Lumumba. Burden wrote in a cable to the State Department, Lumumba has now maneuvered himself into a position of opposition to the West, resistance to the United Nations, and increasing dependence on the Soviet Union and on Congolese supporters who are pursuing Soviets' ends. Only prudent, therefore, to plan on the basis that Lumumba government threatens our vital interest in the Congo and Africa generally. A principal objective of our political and diplomatic action must therefore be to destroy Lumumba government as now constituted, but at the same time, we must find or develop another horse to back which would be acceptable in the rest of Africa and defensible against Soviet political attack. And find another horse they did. You have to understand, Lumumba appealed to the Americans to get the Belgians out first for help, and they refused. So now that they refused, and that the UN wasn't actually doing it, they sent soldiers there, but the idea was that the soldiers were not supposed to be fighting, they were supposed to be maintaining. They were supposed to be maintaining the situation kind of in a bubble, right? They weren't fighting for any particular, they were just defending. So now that Lumumba is backed into a corner, right, and he needs to find a way to get the Belgians out of the Congo to ensure the integrity of the Congolese sovereignty, then he goes ask the Soviets. The United States already said no, and the United States then uses that as evidence that he is, in fact, a communist. And that he's going to lead to Soviet control in the heart of Africa. At this time, the US foreign policy is basically, if you are not with us, you are against us. And if you are not with us, you are probably a communist. You're a Soviet psyop, and we have to destroy you. I also think it's interesting that they did the same thing with Nkrumah. He doesn't even ask the United States, he asks Canada for help in obtaining a nuclear reactor for nuclear power purposes, not for nuclear war purposes. And because of the United States, Canada says no. When he goes to the Soviets and asks for a nuclear reactor, then the United States gets mad. You can't get mad, okay? You already said no. I would have taken your help, but you said no. So I had to go somewhere else. It's like the world doesn't revolve around the United States, guys. Come on, people gotta keep it moving. And something else that I think is interesting is, why is it that when Nkrumah appeals to the Soviets for a nuclear reactor, they actually help him with it? When Lumumba appeals to the Soviets for help pushing the Belgians out, they send troops. The Americans, on the other hand, are hell-bent on not helping the situation and actually making it worse by supporting subversive groups like the freaking Katanga succession. Anyway, CIA Director Alan Dulles agreed with Burden's analysis of the situation and compared Lumumba to Fidel Castro. And in the American mind, that is the worst insult that you could ever call somebody. I mean, you might as well have said that he was Stalin. Lumumba and his advisors flew to New York on July 22, 1960 to meet with Secretary General Hammarskjold at the United Nations headquarters to discuss the Congo crisis. They met on 3 consecutive days to address the secession of Katanga and the removal of Belgian troops. Lumumba implored the UN to push the Belgian troops out by force. However, the UN insisted that they had to rely on diplomacy through negotiations rather than force. This action will have consequences. While he was in the United States, Lumumba went to Washington to appeal to the Americans again for help in pushing the Belgians out, and again, they refused. In fact, President Eisenhower actually refused to meet with Lumumba on the basis that Lumumba had previously met with the Soviet deputy foreign minister. Another thing that pissed Eisenhower off was that he had heard that in a meeting with American businessmen, Lumumba had said that the exploitation of the mineral riches of the Congo should be primarily for the profit of our own people and other Africans. He insisted that Belgium would no longer have a monopoly in the Congo and that the Americans could work out their agreements directly with the Congolese in the future. This was a deadly mistake. Saying it out loud, that was the mistake. And some of Lumumba's advisors actually told him, like, yo, don't say this. You don't want to say this in front of these people. And he went on and he said it anyway. The same day, one of Lumumba's advisors received a call that stated that President Eisenhower prefers to go and play golf than to meet with Lumumba.
Dwight Eisenhower, a president by trade, belts a beauty far down the fairway.
Well, a friend of Lumumba's, Anisette Kashimura, believed that Lumumba was making a grave mistake by making clear his wish for the Congo to take control of its own strategic resources. Kashimura believed that Lumumba thought that the United States would not make him suffer the blow of Massaday if he persisted in wanting to sell raw materials to the countries of the East as well as to the West. Massaday was the Prime Minister of Iran in the early 1950s. He, like Lumumba, was a democratically elected leader who intended to use the natural resources of his country for his people. He was then overthrown in a CIA coup. To really understand the childishness and unscrupulous behavior of the Eisenhower administration towards Lumumba, you have to understand the plane fiasco. The what? The plane fiasco. Like I said, Lumumba urgently flew to New York to meet with the United Nations and discuss the situation in the Congo. In order to fly to New York, he needed a plane, and he requested a plane from the Americans, who initially accepted, but then took it back, saying that there was nothing in it for us, and it would be more to our advantage if he came by Soviet plane. So that's exactly what happened. Left with no other choice, Lumumba came to the United States on a Soviet plane. This, the Americans said, was proof that he was a communist. There was an immediate media frenzy. Lumumba resented this turn of events, saying, "What was I to do? Now it is said that I am a communist. But judge for yourself what was more important, to be regarded as a communist or to turn down an opportunity to go to the UN to defend our interests there. Judge for yourself." As you can imagine, Lumumba returned from his time in the United States by August, completely disillusioned with the Americans. On August 8th, the situation in the Congo deteriorated even further. Under the leadership of Albert Kalanji, the leader of the MNC-k, the region of Kasai seceded. So now, Lumumba was dealing with the secession of Kasai, which was a region that was rich in diamonds, and the secession of Katanga, which was a region that was rich in uranium. Both of these secessions were aided and abetted by American businessmen. The multinational corporation gets the worm. You see, American interference is multifaceted. On one hand, you have the CIA directly interfering in Congolese politics. On the other, you have the State Department supporting the overthrow of democratically elected governments. Then, in a shadowy corner, you have the private sector, conspiring to keep resources of the Congolese in the hands of a few American businessmen. I'm looking at you, Adlai Stevenson, Maurice Templeson, YQPROP. YQPROP. So, to recap, the CIA is funding several Congolese politicians. They are funding Kasavubu, Lumumba's head of government. They are funding Mobutu, Lumumba's current lieutenant colonel. They are funding Joseph Ilio, who is the head of the Congolese Senate, and they are funding Cyril Adula. Through Mobutu, the CIA had an in the Congolese army. Historian David Gibbs writes, Mobutu was able to play a decisive role. The CIA used Mobutu and his soldiers as a freelance strike force. This was done through bribery, and many of Mobutu's soldiers became rich this way. On August 18, 1960, the National Security Council met to discuss the Congo. President Eisenhower and CIA Director Dulles were both present. Official documents show the context of their discussion. Dulles argued that it was important to preserve Katanga as a separate, viable asset. Eisenhower was in agreement. He suggested it might be a good idea if the UN were to recognize Katanga, even though that view contradicted America's official position. The clear consensus around the table was that Lumumba was a threat to American interests and had to be removed. So, what did Eisenhower mean when he said that the democratically elected leader of a foreign government had to be removed? Undersecretary of State Dillon, who was present at the National Security meeting, testified to the Church Committee in 1975, led by Senator Frank Church. The committee conducted a series of investigations into suspicious intelligence activity. In front of Congress, Council staffer Robert H. Johnson testified that President Eisenhower and CIA Director Dulles conspired to assassinate Lumumba. He states that President Eisenhower said something, I can no longer remember his words, that came across to me as an order for the assassination of Lumumba. This account is corroborated by Undersecretary of State Dillon, who testified that an assassination was within the bounds of consideration for the removal of Lumumba. Under the direction of Director Dulles, the CIA got to work immediately. Dulles sent a cable to Larry Devlin, writing that Lumumba's removal must be an urgent and prime object and should be a high priority of our covert actions.
People in Washington were highly concerned about the activities of the Prime Minister, and that they hoped that he would go, there would be a change in the government. The next thing I knew, I received a cable saying that someone by the name of Joe would arrive in Leopoldville, and I was to take my instructions from him. And the instructions were that I was to remove him physically from, in other words, assassinate Lumumba. I asked first, whose instructions are these? And he said, they've come from President Eisenhower. The president wanted this done, and I was to put together these poisons and bring them out to you.
Dulles alluded that the order came from high places, and considering that the president is the only superior to the CIA director, we can assume that he was talking about Eisenhower. To this end, Larry Devlin was given $100,000. He quickly met with Ambassador Burden, who he briefed on the developments at the National Security Council. Dulles told Burden, the leader we could depend on in a showdown with Lumumba was young Colonel Joseph Mobutu, second in command of the Congolese army. Back in the Congo, Lumumba made good on his earlier threat and appealed to the Soviet Union for help kicking out the Belgians. The Soviets sent a ship and air crew to honor his request. As you can imagine, the Americans were displeased at this turn of events. Eisenhower described it as a Soviet invasion. I just think it's funny how. So when the Belgians sent 10,000 soldiers to the Congo, that wasn't a Belgian invasion. That could be dealt with through the auspice of the UN. But when the Soviets sent 300 some soldiers, that was a Soviet invasion. Once again, the Eisenhower administration used this as proof to prove that Lumumba was in fact an agent of the Soviet Union, or at the very least, a communist. Historian David Gibbs set the record straight in his work, The Political Economy of Third World Invasion. There is no evidence that the Soviets actually sought to take control of the Congo. Even if they wanted to, it is very doubtful that they could have done so. At its height, the communist intervention in the Congo comprised no more than 380 Soviets against 14,000 UN troops and many thousands of Belgian military officers. Lumumba wasn't a communist, but honestly, that was neither here nor there. Bronson Tweedy, chief of the CIA's Africa Division in the Directorate of Plans, testified to the Church Committee. The concern with Lumumba was not really the concern with Lumumba as a person. It was concerned at this very pregnant point in the new African development with the effect on the balance of the continent of a disintegration of the Congo. The Congo, after all, was the largest geographical expression. Contained in it were enormously important mineral resources. This was why Washington was so concerned about Lumumba, not because there was something so unique about Lumumba, but it was the Congo. One of the problems that the CIA encountered was that Lumumba was beloved by the people. Even the American public viewed him favorably. The CIA moved quickly to undermine this view. You know, hearts and minds and all that. Devlin recounts how they plotted to achieve this in his memoir. One of our early operations was an anti-Lumumba demonstration when the latter spoke at a meeting of African foreign ministers held in Leopoldville on August 25th. When Lumumba arrived, protesters surrounded him and started shouting, "Down with Lumumba." This undermined Lumumba's image of a man loved by his people and in full control of the nation. And what was Lumumba talking about when he was being sabotaged by American imperialists? Imperialist sabotage. Our Katanga, because of its uranium, copper, and gold, and our Bakwangwa and Kasai, because of its diamonds, have become hotbeds of imperialist intrigues. The object of these intrigues is to recapture economic control of our country. We all know, and the whole world knows, that Algeria is not French, that Angola is not Portuguese, that Kenya is not English. We know the objects of the West. Yesterday, they split us on the level of a tribe, clan, and village. Today, with Africa liberating herself, they seek to divide us on the level of states. In Africa, they want to create antagonistic blocs, satellites, and having begun from the stage of the Cold War, deepen the division in order to perpetuate their rule. It wasn't only enemies from the outside targeting Lumumba. On September 5th, CIA-funded President Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba as Prime Minister. Of course, he did not have the authority to do so. In Lumumba's stead, President Kasavubu nominated the CIA-backed Joseph Ilio. In reaction, the Chamber of Deputies met immediately and decided to overturn the dismissal. Deputy Prime Minister Antoine Gazinga warned Lumumba again to take action against Kasavubu. However, Lumumba once again chose not to act against his enemies. And there were many. When Lumumba went to Radio Leopoldville to address the nation, he was stopped by Ghanaian soldiers, led by Colonel Joseph Ankra. If you've been following, it is weird that Lumumba would be stopped by Ghanaian soldiers because Nkrumah and Lumumba are like this. So if they're being stopped by Ghanaian soldiers, it's because guess who? Guess who Colonel Ankra reported to? General Alexander. When Nkrumah heard about these events, he was furious, and he put the Ghanaian troops under the control of the only legitimate government in the Congo, which was Lumumba's government. Nkrumah's ambassador to the Congo, Jin, once again expressed his concerns about General Alexander, who only months earlier had disarmed the Congolese army. If you would allow me, I would say that this is the culminating point of General Alexander's intrigue and subversive action, which I have time and time again pointed out, and which was confirmed by all the delegations which have paid a visit to the Congo. Jin is fed up! On September 12th, Lumumba was arrested. Arrested by whom, you may ask? Arrested by order of the second-in-command Chief of Staff, Joseph Desire Mobutu. On what grounds, you might ask? For resisting the illegal attempt to dismiss him as Prime Minister of the Congo. It was Ambassador Jin who once again saved the day, insisting that Lumumba be released at once. On September 13th, the Chamber of Deputies voted once again in favor of Lumumba retaining his position as the rightful Prime Minister of the Congo. Since their parliamentary attempts of overthrowing Lumumba did not work, Mobutu and his goons attempted more severe measures. On September 14th, Mobutu led a CIA-sponsored military coup. Larry Devlin, who was never too far behind, stated that the coup of Mobutu seized control and was arranged and supported and indeed managed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Let's talk about Mobutu for a second, okay? Lumumba lifted him up. He protected him from dismissal. He gave him the position in the army that he then used to stage a coup against his government. Everyone was warning him about Mobutu. They said, he's a Belgian informer. He's an American informer. Lumumba said, no, it's okay. He doesn't have money. It's an innocent way for him to make money. He turns around, and what does he do? He betrays his friend, and he betrays his country. A ninja that turns his back on his friends is worse than scum. Hell isn't hot enough. He said, long live Lumumba, and then tried to arrest him. There were now 4 different governments in the Congo. Lumumba's democratically elected government, the secession of Kasai, the secession of Katanga, and the military dictatorship of Mobutu. But surely President Kasavubu, who had vouched for Lumumba at the Round Table Conference in Brussels, would once again. Wrong! Kasavubu saw his opportunity and he took it! Kasavubu, instead of demanding a return to the rule of law and democracy, collaborated with Mobutu and was kept on as president. A Congolese civilian reported, the days that followed Mobutu's seizing of power were like a modern apocalypse. The Congo was on the edge of madness. Kasavubu had at least pretended to conform to the constitutional laws drawn up by Belgian lawyers. Mobutu made no such pretenses. Democracy was completely overthrown and replaced by a military dictatorship. The Congo was no longer safe for Lumumba. He appealed to the United Nations for help, and Rajeshwar Jayal, an Indian diplomat serving as Dag Hammarskjold's representative in the Congo, responded immediately. He sent Ghanaian soldiers to escort Lumumba to his home. The devil works, but the CIA works harder. Operation YQPROP was in full swing. The cryptonym YQ was to designate the operation to assassinate Lumumba, and PROP was used for various clandestine operations. So, Larry Devlin tried to find a way to kill Lumumba. Only days after Mobutu seized power, Larry Devlin met with a biochemist from the CIA, Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was responsible for MK-Ultra, a series of CIA mind control experiments in the 50s and 60s. The project researched methods of altering human behavior using hallucinogens such as LSD. Gottlieb used American civilians in his experiments, specifically people who, in his own words, could not fight back. They were outcasts, prostitutes and their clients, mental patients, convicted criminals, and so on. They were drugged unknowingly and observed. The CIA actually went as far as to set up several brothels in San Francisco where prostitutes would slip their clients the CIA drugs and then the agents would watch through a two-way mirror. Can't make this shit up. Gottlieb did tests on various toxins for the assassination of Lumumba. Eventually, he selected botulinum, which was to be put on anything that Lumumba would put into his mouth, so food or a toothbrush.
One of the poisons was a tube of toothpaste that had poison in it, so that if he'd brushed his teeth with it, that was been the end of the man. All of these things I put in my safe because I didn't want them lying around the office. Somebody may say, may I use your toothpaste?
After he had been killed, his autopsy would show normal traces found in people who die of certain diseases. Gottlieb hand-delivered the poison to Larry Devlin. During the church committee, Devlin was asked if the president had authorized this operation. Gottlieb had apparently told Devlin that, indeed, the president had authorized it. Back in the Congo, Lumumba was being guarded by the UN at his home. On September 20th, Mobutu tried once again to arrest Lumumba. Gizinga had already been arrested by Mobutu's goons, but Lumumba was being kept safe by the UN. The United States then asked the United Nations to allow Mobutu to arrest Lumumba, but Secretary General Hammarskjold refused. On what basis is he being arrested? Like, it's crazy to me that the US was willing to go to the UN and ask, like, can we arrest this guy? Because it's like, so you're openly siding with the guy who just threw the military coup? The guy who just overthrew the government? Because you know that it's a bad look to be like, we support the guy who is bringing dictatorship to the Congo. So why are you out in the open asking, can you guys arrest the actual democratically elected leader? Rajeshwar Dayal was an adamant supporter of Lumumba's government in accordance with the UN Charter. Secretary General Hammarskjold was in full agreement. Mobutu approached Dayal and proposed a round table with all of the Congo's leading politicians. Dayal was pleased by this development and quickly began organizing the round table. Mobutu wrote to Lumumba because his telephone line had been cut and informed him of the plan. In exchange for his participation in the round table, Lumumba asked for the immediate release of Antoine Gizinga, his deputy prime minister. Mobutu acquiesced and Gizinga was freed, although he would walk back his proposal of a round table shortly after. The United Nations position towards the Congo is summarized in an interview with Dayal. Mr. Dayal, if Colonel Mobutu goes to New York, through what mechanism will the UN continue to deal? Through the only legally elected body. Will that mean the commissaire? No, the commissaire is solely a creation of Mobutu's. The parliament is the only duly elected body, as is the government formed under it. You mean to say that you would then deal with Lumumba's government and him? We certainly would. After all, he is still the only duly elected leader here, and we must proceed on the basis of democratic principle. Shout out Dayal, right? I mean, come on. Let's go. Because I complain about the UN being useless, but, I mean, well, in this situation, you'll see, decide for yourself, But the Americans were not concerned about democratic principles. We never let democratic principles stop us before, girl. Why start now? After arranging the anti-Lumumba protest, Devlin's next plot was to release correspondence between Lumumba and Nkrumah. However, he did not only publish correspondence between the two African leaders, he also published several letters that showed Lumumba appealing to the Soviets and to the Chinese. Within these letters, Lumumba allegedly wrote that the Soviets should come to the Congo and execute his political opponents. Very smooth, Devlin. As it turns out, the letters to the Soviets and the Chinese were complete forgeries. This was brought up by the man, the myth, the legend, Rajeshwar Dayal. I mean, he's legendary. Come on. The only person with a brain Every time you think to yourself, the CIA would... They would. They've done it once and they'll do it again. Dial said that it was obvious that some foreign hand was behind the conspiracy, for the Congolese did not have the means or the experience to produce such a document. The voice of reason! Unfortunately, the reputational damage had already been done, and at a pivotal moment, too. The UN General Assembly. On September 20th, 1960, the 15th session of the UN General Assembly opened. On September 22nd, President Eisenhower addressed the delegates, speaking on the Congo crisis. The people of the Congo are entitled to build up their country in peace and freedom. Intervention by other nations in their internal affairs would deny them that right and create a focus of conflict in the heart of Africa. Eisenhower is literally that one meme that's like, I hate people that work at the bank. Shh, I work at the bank. Here is $1. He's like, obviously he's talking to the Soviets and he's like, do not interfere within their internal affairs while he is interfering in their internal affairs. Mind you, according to the minutes of a meeting that Eisenhower had with a British politician the day before making that speech, he had just expressed his wish that Lumumba would fall into a river of crocodiles. During the General Assembly, Nkrumah met with Eisenhower. Nkrumah wanted to discuss the Congo, but Eisenhower preferred to reminisce on his days during World War II. He assured Nkrumah, however, that the United Nations was resolving the situation. The next day, Nkrumah addressed the General Assembly.
It is impossible for a saint to be neutral on the issue of good and evil, as it is for the United Nations to be neutral on the issue of legality and illegality.
The Americans did not like this speech. We all know this game at this point. What did they say that it showed? That he was a communist! Yay! Meanwhile, the Americans and the British came together to exchange notes on Lumumba. Turns out they had a common goal: assassination. The British ambassador to the Congo sent a telegram to London urging for a more active policy to neutralize Lumumba. Howard F.T. Smith of the British Foreign Service wrote, I see only two possible solutions to the problem. The first is the simple one of ensuring Lumumba's removal from the scene by killing him. This should, in fact, solve the problem. Not mincing words, straight to the point. Sharpshooter. The second possible solution was diminishing Lumumba's influence, but Smith noted that it would be better for Lumumba to be removed from the scene altogether. If you know what I mean. Back in the Congo, Lumumba was coming to terms with his fate. He gathered with friends and told them somberly, For me, it's finished. I feel that I am going to die. I will die like Gandhi. If I die tomorrow, it's because a foreigner gave arms to a Congolese. At this point, Lumumba is being targeted simultaneously by the Americans, by the Belgians, and by the British. And on the other hand, the United Nations, which was meant to be an independent body, was being infiltrated by the CIA. The CIA at the United Nations. Owen Roberts, an American Foreign Service officer, spoke about the CIA's activity at the United Nations. He recounted that CIA agents would carry cash to bribe delegates to vote in one way or another. The CIA made some payoffs, I know, to Congolese delegations, and maybe to some others. An African would be confused as to whether I was a satchel carrier or not, meaning one of the Americans carrying bribes. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, the CIA funded a bunch of nonprofits that were working with the United Nations. But that's not actually the worst of it. All communications going in and out of the UN, highly sensitive information meant for only the ears and eyes of Dag Hammarskjold and his staff, were being intercepted by the CIA. The cipher machines that the UN used were made by a company called Crypto AG, which was secretly owned by the CIA. The Washington Post ran an article covering this scandal where the correspondent noted that the account identifies the CIA officers who ran the program and the company executives entrusted to execute it. It traces the origin of the venture as well as the internal conflicts that nearly derailed it. It describes how the United States and its allies exploited other nations' gullibility for years, taking their money and stealing their secrets. The other nations involved in this ruse were the United Kingdom, Israel, Sweden, and Switzerland. More than 120 countries use Crypto AG equipment from the 1950s well into the 2000s. As you can imagine, this gave the United States an enormous advantage in foreign policy dealings, although its main competitors, the Soviet Union and China, did not use Crypto AG because they were suspicious of the company that had such strong ties to the West. This would be funny if it wasn't evil, because what the US was basically doing and the CIA was doing was they were making their competitors, other countries, pay them to give them their secrets. I mean, listen, you gotta give it to them. You gotta give it to them. No stone left unturned. On October 10th, 1960, Mobutu tried to arrest Lumumba for the third time. Bro, like, give it up. Give it up already. Once again, his troops were turned away by the UN guards that were guarding Lumumba's residence. Mobutu went to Dial for help, who not only refused, but actually reinforced Lumumba's guard. This angered the CIA, and Larry Devlin sent a quick cable to Washington. The station has consistently urged Congolese leaders to arrest Lumumba in belief Lumumba will continue be threat to stability Congo until removed from scene. So Larry Devlin, in his own words, showing that the CIA was trying to arrest Lumumba under what charges. Listen, there's no rule of law. It doesn't matter what the charges are. Straight to jail. Mobutu sent 200 soldiers to encircle Lumumba's house. Lumumba was now effectively trapped within his own home, as there was a circle of UN guard around it, and then outside of that, a greater circle of Mobutu's goons. This created another headache for Larry Devlin, who wrote to Washington requesting a gun. Not been able to penetrate Lumumba's entourage. Recommend HQ's pouch Sonnet high-powered foreign-make rifle with telescopic scope and silencer. On October 27th, the National Security Council approved $250,000 for the CIA to use to support a Mobutu government. The Council also authorized the CIA to provide training and ammunition for Mobutu's military. Corruption in the United Nations. Rajeshwar Dayal stated in his book, Mission for Hammarskjold, that the Western powers were firmly opposed to a return to constitutional rule, because that would necessitate the return of Lumumba. Therefore, in November of 1960, Dayal writes that the Western powers seized on the figure of Kasavubu to make their point by bringing him over in person to New York as the head of the Congolese delegation. As the undisputed head of state, he had the right to address the General Assembly. So did Lumumba, but he was being held hostage in his house. And anyways, the Americans wouldn't have given him a visa to enter the United States, given that they were trying to kill him and all. Thomas Kanza, the Congolese delegate to the UN, echoed Dayal's analysis. The American game was all too obvious. In the constitutional confusion reigning in the Congo, they needed a legal and Congolese entry to permit their maneuvers and to confound their critics all over the world. They decided to get Kasavubu into the UN, an individual who could embody the Congo as a nation. Once recognized by the UN, Kasavubu could ratify every initiative from Washington, which was then, in the eyes of the world, acting fully in conformity with the wishes of the President of the Republic of the Congo and in collaboration with the UN authorities there. To this end, Kasavubu flew to New York. But the affair didn't go as smoothly as the Western powers had hoped. The delegation of non-aligned Asian and African member states were fiercely resisting this manipulation of events. President Sékou Touré wrote a draft resolution proposing a delegation representing Lumumba's government. Ghana's ambassador to the UN proposed that the debate be suspended until the Conciliation Committee, which had been sent to the Congo to restore order, completed its work. Mobutu was fiercely opposed to this, which is obvious because you staged a military coup. Are you going to want to work with the guys that are trying to restore democracy? And the Americans didn't like it either because one of the aims of the Conciliation Committee was to get all of the Congolese leaders to attend a roundtable, which would include Lumumba. A vote was taken, and the Western powers and all of their followers voted against. But the African and Asian blocs were strong, and the Western powers were ultimately defeated. But not for long. Not for long! The U.S. pressed for the committee to recognize the credentials of Kasavubu's delegation. Within days, it was accepted. Dial wrote of this decision, "It was common knowledge in the corridors and lounges that the intensest pressure had been applied to force countries to change their votes, if not their convictions, from affirmation to abstention, and from abstention to negation." Remember Howard Embry, the CIA agent? He's back in the mix. In an interview in 2001, he described how he helped turn the tide in favor of Kasavubu. There was a fight between President Kasavubu and Lumumba. Lumumba was prime minister, Kasavubu the president. Each one could seek a delegation at the United Nations, but there could be only one delegation. They both had the right to seek it. Now we figured that if Kasavubu seated his delegation at the United Nations, it would be a pro-American one, and if Lumumba seated his, God knows what it would be. So Ambassador Timberlake, who is a very good friend of mine, knew that I had this public relations office, and he asked if I would take on the job of taking on Kasavubu, which I would get paid for by my organization and the expenses would be met. So I agreed to do that, and they sent over Kasavubu, and with a little bit of engineering, we got Kasavubu into the United Nations and seated his delegation. Unsurprisingly, Belgium, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and South Africa all voted for Kasavubu's delegation. When those guys link up, when they're on the same side. However, for the Western powers, this was not a flawless victory. By backing Kasavubu, the West had forced many African countries to side with the Soviet Union in support of Lumumba. Back at Lumumba's house, Larry Devlin was getting increasingly frustrated with his failure to really kill Lumumba. Reminds me of that scene in Cusco's New Groove. Cusco's poison, the poison for Cusco, the poison used to kill Cusco. Devlin sent a cable on November 14th that read, "Target has not left the building in several weeks. House guarded day and night by Congolese and UN troops. Congolese troops are there to prevent Target's escape and to arrest him if he attempts. UN troops there to prevent storming of palace by Congolese. Attempting get coverage of any movement into or out of house by Congolese. Target has dismissed most of servants, so entry by this means seems remote." So the CIA had to think of another way to get to Lumumba. Since he was under UN protection, they wouldn't be able to touch him until he actually left his residence. But he also couldn't leave his residence because Mobutu's soldiers were, that they were going to sick him as soon as he got out. It was on site. Devlin wrote to Washington explaining the importance of getting Lumumba out in the open. He then devised a plan where a CIA agent would go into Lumumba's residence dressed as a UN officer and proposed to escort Lumumba outside. This person would be referred to as QJWIN. QJWIN, posing as redacted officer, would enter target's home and provide escort out of residence. We know that QJWIN is a cryptonym for a clandestine officer who worked for the CIA, but not all of these documents are actually unclassified, so there's still a lot that we don't know. In declassified documents, the government writes that QJWIN was never actually used in the plot to assassinate Lumumba, as they allegedly declined the assignment. However, like I said, many documents in relation to the assassination of Lumumba and the CIA involvement of it are still classified, so it's difficult to know for sure. In Stanleyville, Antoine Gizinga and other Lumumba supporters were trying to engineer a way to safely get Lumumba out of his home. But to their surprise, on Sunday, November 27, 1960, Lumumba escaped under the cover of night during a thunderstorm. How exactly Lumumba escaped remains a mystery. Mobutu claims that Lumumba had escaped by boat, walking down to the river that was next to his house and then kayaking upstream. Devlin claimed that UN peacekeepers must have helped Lumumba escape by car, which is interesting because that's the exact proposition that the CIA made when they were trying to figure out a way to kill Lumumba. When Gizinga learned that Lumumba had escaped, he was distraught. Dial wrote, how Lumumba was able to slip through both the UN guards, whose duty it was to keep out unwanted visitors, as well as the ANC troops, who were there to prevent his escape, remains a mystery. Normally, the UN Guard would not concern itself with an outgoing vehicle, but had the Congolese troops been bribed, or were they caught napping? Had they been bribed indeed? In Larry Devlin's testimony to the Church Committee, he claims that he was quite certain there was no agency involvement in any way regarding Lumumba's escape that night. That would be awfully convenient because whoever was responsible for Lumumba's escape was also responsible for his untimely death. As soon as word spread that Lumumba escaped, a manhunt started. The Americans perused the skies in a helicopter. The day after his escape, Larry Devlin sent a cable to Washington which read, "Station working with Congolese government to get roads blocked and troops alerted, blocking possible escape route." Lumumba was on his way to Stanleyville, having crossed the Congo River by ferry. Lumumba and his supporters continued the journey when at one port town they were stopped by ANC Congolese troops. Villagers ran to the UN post to plead for help when they were refused by a British officer working under the Ghana UN contingent. And who was in command of the Ghana UN troops? None other than General Alexander. Boo! Boo! Get off the stage! Oh, brother, this guy stinks! Thankfully, the British officer was ignored by his troops, who immediately took up arms to rescue Lumumba from the clutches of the ANC. They forced the Congolese troops out and escorted Lumumba until he reached the next town. In the next town, thousands of people were waiting to hear Lumumba speak, and the ANC were waiting for him in cars provided by the Belgians. The ANC's plans were foiled once again by a villager who jumped into Lumumba's car and sped away. This made the ANC think that Lumumba himself was trying to escape, and while they chased the villager, Lumumba went to the next town. Once again, Lumumba was able to escape because of the love of his people. On Thursday, December 1st, Lumumba and his supporters arrived at the Sankuru River, where they waited for the ferry so that they could cross. Unbeknownst to them, they had been spotted by ANC soldiers in a helicopter. The soldiers seized the ferry and took Lumumba prisoner. Once again, a villager ran to the UN troops and appealed on Lumumba's behalf. Lumumba himself shouted to a British lieutenant working for the UN, "Lieutenant, I am the Prime Minister. I request United Nations protection." In response, the lieutenant turned his back on Lumumba. Under all normal circumstances, this lieutenant, considering he was working under the United Nations and the United Nations were supposed to protect Lumumba, he should have protected him from the Congolese troops. However, likely because of General Alexander's subversive acts that Gazinga has been warning Lumumba about for this entire timeline, the officer did not. And this action will have consequences. Lumumba was seized and pushed into an ANC vehicle. When the African UN troops heard of this, they were furious and immediately began the search for Lumumba. But it was too late. Once Lumumba was captured, he was flown to Leopoldville, where the international press were waiting at the airport. He showed signs of having been beaten. An Associated Press correspondent reported, "Colonel Mobutu, his arms crossed, watched calmly while the soldiers slapped and pushed the prisoner and pulled his hair." The murder of Lumumba.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Taken to Mobutu's headquarters, past a jeering, threatening crowd, Lumumba was impassive at this lowest ebb of his stormy career. Mobutu watched as his troops manhandled Lumumba, but promised the pro-red Lumumba a fair trial on charges of inciting the army to rebellion. Lumumba was removed to an army prison outside the capital, as his supporters in Stanleyville seized control of Oriental province and threatened a return of disorder. Before that, Lumumba suffered more indignities, including being forced to eat a speech, which he restated his claim to be the Congo's rightful premier. Even in bonds, Lumumba remains a dangerous prisoner, storm center of savage loyalties and equally savage opposition.
Rajeshwar Dayal was appalled by this turn of events. He sent a message of protest to the Kasavubu government immediately, which responded that Lumumba would be treated with human dignity. Okay. UN Secretary General Hammarskjold also personally intervened, writing a message of protest to Kasavubu. But this message was ignored. In his prison cell, Lumumba had nothing to eat or drink for 3 days. A journalist who interviewed Lumumba in his cell wrote down his last words. "All peoples have had to fight for their freedom. We have chosen only one weapon for our struggle, non-violence. The only weapon that would bring victory in dignity and honor. Onward, men and women citizens, to the building of a united, proud, and prosperous Congo. A radiant future is dawning on our horizon. Long live the independent and sovereign Republic of the Congo." A riot broke out at the prison where Lumumba was incarcerated. Many soldiers called for Lumumba to be set free. Mobutu acted quickly, transferring Lumumba to a prison in the Kasai region, which was the region that had seceded under the leadership of Albert Kalanji, who hated Lumumba with a passion. Lumumba was then moved to Katanga, led by Shambi, another region which had seceded with the generous help of the United States. Once Lumumba arrived in Katanga, he was beaten and tortured relentlessly. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was driven to a remote spot in Katanga, not far from the Shinkolobwe mine. There, he was led to a tree in front of a firing squad of 4 men. At 9:43 p.m., Lumumba was riddled with bullets. His body was cut up with a hacksaw and dissolved in sulfuric acid. Lumumba was dead. The role of the CIA in Lumumba's killing is still murky. CIA whistleblower John Stockwell wrote, "Eventually, we learned Lumumba was killed, not by our poisons, but beaten to death, apparently by men who were loyal to men who had agency cryptonyms and received agency salaries. So let me ask you this. If I had a gun, and I had some money, and I told somebody, I'll give you this money if you go execute this guy, and they did, does that make me responsible for his death? A CIA report stated on February 7th, 1961 that a Belgian officer of Flemish origin executed Lumumba with a burst of submachine gunfire at 2300 Z17 Jan. An ear was severed from Lumumba's head and sent to Albert Kalanchi, president of South Kasai. Several bad actors were responsible for the death of Lumumba. A UN investigation into his death in 1961 concluded that President Kasavubu and his aides on the one hand, and the provincial government of Katanga, headed by Mr. Shambe, on the other, should not escape responsibility for the death of Mr. Lumumba. A Belgian inquiry in 2001 found that King Baudouin and his aides were aware of the plot to kill Lumumba and gave it a veiled blessing. The United States, of course, was always at the forefront of the action. When the international community learned of Lumumba's death, people were furious.
This is Movie Tone, Jeffrey Sumner reporting. Arrest, ill treatment, imprisonment, death. Such was the fate of Patrice Lumumba. And it has been the signal for violent reactions in many parts of the world. First in the United Nations itself, where a Security Council meeting was violently interrupted. Fights continued in the lobbies and corridors. A series of struggles went on, and in the course of this would-be demonstration against the handling of the Congo situation, 18 United Nations guards were injured in making arrests. Now to reaction in Yugoslavia. This was the scene in Belgrade, where a crowd estimated at 150,000 people marched through the streets, a demonstration of disgust and anger. In Paris, the Federation of African Students demonstrated near the Belgian embassy. They said it was to show their concern over events in Africa and to express their mourning at the death of Lumumba. It wasn't long, however, before they were involved in clashes with the police, who aimed at keeping them on the move away from the embassy. A few of the demonstrators, disinclined to obey, were arrested. Finally, reaction in Cairo. Carrying Lumumba's picture, a large crowd marched to the Belgian embassy. Demonstrators climbed the railings and began their anti-Belgian protest by kicking down the embassy shield.
Protests broke out in New York, Paris, Vienna, Moscow, Peking, Warsaw, Damascus, Jakarta, Cairo, London, Lagos, Havana, and New Delhi. In Accra, Nkrumah organized a memorial for his friend. African-American leaders like Malcolm X spoke on his assassination.
Congolese have been massacred by white people in the Congo for years and years and years. And if the shoe is now on the other foot, only thing I can say is it's like chickens that always come back home to roost.
Do you personally feel, though, that there's some shame or involvement here or some guilt associated with the killing of other human beings?
I think that the white people should be ashamed of the deplorable situation that has been existing in the Congo, which is not the fault of the Congolese, but which is the result of instigation by European powers who are fighting each other over the mineral wealth of the Congo. And now to make it appear that the Congolese themselves are criminals or brutes because they're reacting to these injustices that they've been victimized by is again ducking the question.
Chambi is the murderer of Lumumba, who was the rightful prime minister of the Congo. Chambi is the man whose forces fought against the United Nations forces and against the United States, and despite this criminal past of Chambi, now the United States is backing Chambi, who has hired South African mercenaries who are hired killers to disrupt the peaceful efforts of the freedom fighters from Stanleyville to make the type of country there that they want. And it is this American support of Chambi, actually, that's at the root of the whole problem.
The death of Hammarskjold. In September of 1961, UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjold flew from the Congo to North Rhodesia. On his journey, he brought with him 2 of the aforementioned cipher machines. Unbeknownst to Hammarskjold, his every communication was being intercepted by the CIA. He would never be privy to this information because his plane crashed on the way to North Rhodesia. The UN reopened the investigation into Hammarskjold's death in 2015. Mohamed Othman, the former Chief Justice in Tanzania, led the investigation. Othman concluded, "It appears plausible that an external attack or threat may have been a cause of the crash, whether by way of a discrete attack or by causing a momentary distraction of the pilots. I have yet to see evidence that the Soviets attempted to overthrow or assassinate African leaders. There is, however, ample evidence that the Americans did so, whether that be the CIA-sponsored coup of Patrice Lumumba, the later CIA-sponsored coup of Kwame Nkrumah, or the CIA-sponsored civil war in Angola and Mozambique." Larry Devlin wrote in his memoir, "For those who think we should not have attempted to remove Lumumba from power, I can only say I believed that his lack of understanding of world politics and his dalliance with the Soviet Union made him a serious danger to the United States. We were, after all, involved in a major war, albeit a cold one. Had the Soviet Union succeeded in gaining control of a large part of the African continent and its resources, it could have carried us over the thin line into a hot war. In a hot war, one has to kill one's enemies or be defeated. In the Cold War, it was much the same, only one had to remove the enemy from a position of power in which he could contribute to the weakening of the United States' role in the world." But honestly, these justifications fall flat when you look at what happened to the Congo after Devlin and the CIA, and by extension the United States, overthrew and helped kill Lumumba. The CIA backed Mobutu, who was a horrible dictator who had many political executions and human rights violations for the years that he was in power. It was a disaster for the Congolese people, and the CIA was complicit in his crimes. The CIA tries to save its ass. Funny enough, while I was writing this script, I came across a book review that discussed the book that I was reading for research on this video. It's right here. It's amazing. White Malice by Susan Williams. Should be a must-read. And the book review was by the CIA. It claimed to be by a former CIA agent, and it said, "Williams offers nothing new or compelling to prove that, despite the wide ranges of options explored by the U.S. government, the CIA had anything more than official relations with Congolese forces that overthrew Lumumba, or that the CIA had a hand in Lumumba's murder by Katongan rivals on January 17, 1961.
I felt that I had some pretty good operations going, and in the long term, my operations would achieve the objective of removing Lumumba from office, but not killing him."
Lumumba had just promoted his personal secretary, Joseph Mobutu, to Army Chief of Staff. Mobutu was to coordinate with the UN troops to stop the country's descent into anarchy. Instead, he turned to Larry Devlin.
Mobutu said that the army was very unhappy with the prime minister because he was turning the army over to the Soviets. He wanted to mount a coup d'etat, but there was one condition. They had to know that they would have the support of the United States government. I had tried and failed to achieve by legal means what they wanted, the United States government wanted. So I stood up and shook his hand. Finally, it took me a while to do this, and said, I guarantee you the support of the United States government.
I'm sorry, Larry Devlin, the chief of the CIA in the Congo, testified before Congress that the coup of Mobutu seized control and was arranged and supported and indeed managed by the CIA. I think the CIA thinks we're stupid, guys. It says that, the book doesn't prove that, in fact, it was the CIA that killed him. We have a CIA whistleblower, John Stockwell, who says clearly that, in fact, the people who killed him were reporting to people who had CIA cryptonyms and were working with the CIA. So maybe it's too many degrees of separation for you, but not for me. Not for me! Thank you for making it all the way till the end. If you enjoyed this video, please click the subscribe button down below. And here are 2 other videos that you can watch if you are interested in history and politics. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Goodbye.